But I'm starting now in the letter of Paul to the Romans, and starting in the first chapter. And here it says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated, set apart to the gospel of God, which he had promised in advance by his prophets in the Holy Scripture. Now, this is quite interesting, because what I'm finding is, I've preached many times from Romans, but once you really get into, study it and see the background of it, Paul is quite clear here that he regards himself as a servant or a slave of Jesus Christ. He says that he was called to be an apostle. We know that that is correct because it was a divine calling. He was not one of the original 12. And sometime with you, I need to look at the whole life and character of Paul, because he's very unusual, very unique, and it's amazing in a way how God actually called and chose him. And what it does indicate is that the scripture is right when it says many are called, but few are chosen. And there's no question, both even in scripture and certainly in history, and I believe also today, that there are people who are set apart by God for a specific purpose. I mean, you can even see in the case of Moses, where the Jewish boys were being killed, but his parents, for some reason, chose Moses, and he had a brother and sister, remember, chose him to save him from being killed, put him in the basket in the reeds, and the Pharaoh's daughter rescued him. So there is an indication that right from the moment of his birth, that there was some calling, some specific purpose that God was going to fulfill in the life of Moses. We know what that was. But in one sense, I'm seeing that the same thing applies with Paul. But let me deal with this first chapter. I will deal with Paul as an individual later. So what he's saying is that as a servant of Jesus Christ, he was separated for a purpose. He was set apart for a purpose, which was to proclaim the gospel of God. And this gospel, which was proclaimed in the Old Testament, is concerning who Jesus Christ is. Now, I find this is very interesting. In actual fact, I do look actually at one of the other translations. I think it's the New International Version. And here it puts it, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel which was promised in advance by the prophets concerning Jesus. So while we look at the gospel, for me as an evangelist, to me the gospel is preaching the gospel of salvation. But in actual fact, what Paul is saying is the gospel itself is something even deeper. The gospel is the revelation of the Old Testament prophecy that Jesus, who was born, was the Son of God. So that the news which was revealed by the prophets, but yet the amazing thing is, although the Jews in their religion had the prophets and studied the prophets to exclusion, and even today the Orthodox Jews study the scripture, and in fact there is a problem with Orthodox Jews in Israel, is because they are actually they don't work. They're paid by the state. And at this moment, they're still not called, although there's an argument about this, they're not called up for the compulsory national service. So their whole life, the Orthodox Jew, is devoted to the studying of the prophets and the scripture. And yet the scripture is very clear that God has blinded their eyes so that although they have the scripture, they have the prophecies, they don't see and don't understand. And there is a danger even today that there are many people who might call themselves Christians, many people who read the Bible still are blinded and don't understand the real truth that God is trying to reveal and is revealing. And that's what Paul is saying is he's been set apart in order to demonstrate and prove to the world who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God. And also not only that, but by the time you get to verse 3, of course, that Jesus Christ made of the seed of David. So it actually confirms that Jesus was a descendant of David of the royal line, and inheriting, and the others, like David himself, were predecessors of and forerunners of the Christ who was come. And in verse 4, and declared to be the Son of God with power, by the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. So the whole declaration of the Old Testament is concerning Christ, that he was the Son of God, and that it would be demonstrated by the resurrection. And you know, this was one major argument between the scribes and the Pharisees, where the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so what you've got is a blindness that they don't see, that the miracle of the birth of Christ and the resurrection from the dead, foretold in the Old Testament, now comes to life at Christ's birth. And this has to be declared. And Paul says that he's being called and set apart for the specific purpose of declaring who Jesus really is. And although most of us would quite clearly recognize who Jesus is today as Christians, born-again Christians, yet we have to realize that this is something that God is demonstrating and needs to be demonstrated to the world. That this is not just a religion, because he's going to talk about that again later in this chapter. This is not a religion, but it is simply the power of God released through Jesus Christ, by whom we have received grace and apostleship by being obedient to the faith. So what we have to do is have obedience to this faith and belief in the knowledge of who Jesus is. So the whole of our salvation is centered on Christ and Christ alone, no one else. That's where religion fails, because unless the whole thing is centered on the person of Jesus Christ, there is no salvation.